Okay, recording is on. You can take it away, Steve.
Okay, and this meeting is public, recorded, and posted to YouTube. So if you don't like that, get off now. We're going to open this up with community updates. There's only a couple things here. Kubernetes as a project had an initiative to append a security context to SIG charters. And this is to list specific people who get contacted in the event of security issues. Excuse me, let me mute my phone. The other generic community thing I'll bring up is that I, along with Michael Gash, are working on a blog post. Well, it started out as a blog post on best practices for deploying Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. As we got into this, it's become obvious that this is getting so detailed that this is more likely to be a multi-post series. But we've got it at the draft stage, and if there are people interested in, we're not going to publish it yet, but if there are people who have the interest in time to participate in a review, particularly we'd like users to verify that this blog is going in a direction that answers the kinds of questions they'd have. Please contact myself or Michael Gash, and we'll get you a share to that draft document. That's it on the community updates. Fabio, you want to cover active projects?
Yeah. So from the active project side, we have a bunch of things today. We have a lot of updates on the cloud provider side. So as you might know, we have this cloud provider vSphere sub-project that we started a couple of weeks ago. We do run a weekly meeting every Wednesday where we have a quick sync up on what is going on for the cloud provider. Cloud provider vSphere is one of the in-tree cloud providers in Kubernetes, and with this sub-project, what we're trying to do is we're trying to extract the code and put the cloud provider code into an out-of-tree provider, which is the trajectory that Kubernetes as a project wants to have for all the cloud providers. So all the cloud providers should be removed from the Kubernetes repo sooner than later. There's no clear commit on the date where all the cloud providers should be off tree, but better start working as soon as possible on that. And OpenStack has been kind of leading this and be at the forefront as their 1.11 release is approaching code freeze. I think actually code freeze started this week. OpenStack actually has deprecated their own cloud provider that is sitting in tree, and they're now pushing users to use their out-of-tree provider, which is more up-to-date. That said, what we have here is we have a bunch of updates. Let me see if I can share my screen very quickly. And this should be it.
Okay, we can see it.
Okay. So we have a new repo, cloud provider vSphere. We added a security context for this repo as Jesse Frizzell started sending out PRs, sending out issues actually to all the repos in Kubernetes org to ask for a security context for the code security issues. Right now, we don't have much to show here, so these are just the placeholders basically, but we comply with that request. I guess that most importantly is that we actually have this repo pulled into the Prow and Tide CI mechanism, so we have all the integrations done already. This was a bit of work because there's no documentation for this process, and I had to figure out how to do that through asking people and looking.
Good job. Congratulations there, because Tide and Prow is quite difficult to understand. I agree. So good job. Maybe consider writing some of that up for others that may be going through the same process.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually part of the ask from the people that helped me, is to document the process, because apparently a few people went through that process and there was no documentation coming out of those efforts. So I'm actually writing down a Google Doc that I can share with the community afterwards. So we have something that other people can peruse next time. So once we've done that, I started working on a prototype of the first cloud controlling manager. So I have a PR out, which is the one you're looking at right now. There's a lot of support files here. The PR looks big, but it's really not. It's just a bunch of make files, and so there's not a lot of code here. But the most important bit of this PR is that there's actually a CCM that is compiling and that implements the vSphere cloud provider. It hasn't been tested automatically because we don't have any mean to test it in CI right now. We're gonna actually touch on that in this call. But if you have a vSphere environment and you're willing to test it manually, please do. Please check out this PR. It hasn't been merged yet. It's right now it's in code review, but it is compiling. So if you're able to test this, please reach out to me. Check out this PR. There's a makefile that helps you compile the cloud provider binary without too much effort. I know there's a lot of dependencies that have to be pulled in order to compile it. So there's a bash script that pulls down a bunch of Docker containers and compiles the entire thing inside the container, pulling dependency and everything. So it should be pretty straightforward to have the binary compile. So again, if you're able to, reach out and I'll be happy to assist you in testing this thing. Next thing we have on the agenda, and this is also for cloud provider. You probably know from the community updates or maybe from things that have flown on the Slack, the Kubernetes Slack. SIG Cloud Provider has been formed as of last week, and the SIG Cloud Provider is what came out of the Cloud Provider Working Group. This is actually the Cloud Provider Working Group graduating into from a working group into a SIG, a full-blown SIG. And the charter for the SIG is to oversee all the cloud providers from all the vendors. We, as a SIG VMware, we reviewed the charter and reviewed the proposal before it was submitted for acceptance by the steering committee. So we agree on transitioning the cloud provider vSphere sub-project into SIG Cloud Provider. This hasn't happened yet because the new SIG is, again, brand new. They haven't had the first meeting yet. So right now, nothing changes for the time being. So the meeting is going to be at the same time. We're going to still be sponsored by SIG VMware. We're going to still be part of SIG VMware until further notice. So nothing changes. But if you're interested in the work, please join SIG Cloud Provider. Actually, they just changed the name of the Slack channel. So it used to be Cloud Provider, the Cloud Provider -WG. Now it's SIG-Cloud-Provider. So please join the channel. The new meeting is going to be published soon. So the new meeting is going to be an hour-long bi-weekly meeting, and everything that has to do with cloud providers, not just for vSphere, but also for every other cloud provider out there, is going to happen in that call. So please join. And that is pretty much it for the cloud provider updates. So coming out of the cloud provider discussion, something else popped up during various discussions in the community. One of them being how to test vSphere. So we do have a parallel effort going on at VMware trying to get the CI for CNCF, so cncf.ci, to run tests for CNCF projects, so Kubernetes and Prometheus and others, to test on vSphere platforms. So we have a team of people, and we have capacity that was sponsored by VMware, so vSphere capacity, that we're going to use to run the CNCF tests on. And part of this capacity can and will be used to run Kubernetes tests as well. Given that there's no current, or at least there's no public test happening on vSphere in the Kubernetes community, And there's and vSphere being, an hypervisor platform has a lot of touch points with many of the SIGs out there. We were discussing if it's worth to start a working group, and a working group that can provide a virtualization level test beds for not just cloud provider. Obviously, vSphere cloud provider will be a very good candidate for that, but also for things like CSI providers for SIG storage, or CNI plugins for SIG networks, and so on. So we have Andrew here.
Yeah.
And
Sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, no,
you've
no.
been working on this
Please finish. I was saying, please finish. I didn't know you were about to hand it over. I just wanted to throw something in there, but please finish what you were saying.
No, I just wanted to say that you've been working on this CNCF project for a couple of weeks, and I think I wanted to float this with you and the rest of the community here, and see if you think and the other people think it's a good idea. I think it's worthwhile to have something that spans across SIG, and we can help test on especially on a platform that is maybe not widely available to people, given it's a commercial product.
No, I mean, I think it's a great idea. What I was actually going to, the reason I was jumping in is because you were talking about it being an option to test these different configurations. And when we spoke, I remember coining the term that I was going to use is, it's sort of like in the cloud on-prem, because we're doing it via the VMware VMware Cloud on AWS, known as VMC, and it's a software-defined data center. So it will provide the capacity to do on-prem testing in the cloud for any organization who is involved with Kubernetes in some manner, form, or fashion, but finds it difficult to provide test coverage for aspects of Kubernetes about which those people care due to hardware limitations, time to merge PRs or whatnot. So we're not just going to provide test coverage for ourselves for things like what you'd been talking about earlier, the vSphere cloud provider, now that it's out of tree, or the Minikube tests. By the way, I apologize. My children just got home from camp, so you may hear them in the background. But since we have to set all this up and maintain this for ourselves, we do want to make it available to others. And it just makes sense to us to form a cross-SIG working group to decide to sort of manage the idea of a non-GCE based test coverage platform. And we want to see who else might be interested, and hopefully there are a number of people that are. And Fabio, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Or
I just want to see if there's somebody else that is interested in this and maybe in participating and getting this off the ground.
Yeah, definitely. This is Vasu from SAP, but I think I'm going to touch on that in the next slot anyway.
This is Hippie Hacker, and I worked on and founded the Cross Cloud project, which is the CNCF CI. And I just wanted to make sure that we were connected well there. And I wanted to see.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I was going to say that, yeah, we actually have a meeting with Taylor.
Taylor.
Sorry, I was yelling at my kids. We have a meeting with Taylor and Lucinia later today to review outstanding items. Hui is on the call. He's been doing the bulwark, he's been doing most of the work there for Terraform. We've come across some interesting problems, solved them, have PRs out to places like CoreOS Ignition and their transpiler. So hopefully our goal is to have vSphere as one of the columns on the CNCF Cross Cloud dashboard by at least a PR submitted by July 6th. So that's awesome. In a few weeks. And the code will work on vanilla vSphere as well as vSphere on VMC.
Is there
Thanks
anything
for
that
that.
you think, is there any like alignment that you think that we're missing? Because I think right now, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially we have infrastructure and we're just supporting multiple use cases. And one of the ways we're supporting right now is CNCF. The next one's going to be the Kubernetes testing matrix. But is there something beyond that where the CNCF like cross-cloud testing can align to this more than just common infrastructure?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I hear you, Clint, and that's why I sort of coined or described it as on-prem in the cloud. So instead of thinking of it as common infrastructure, think of it as a use case where you're needing to do on-prem testing, but you may just not have the resources yourselves. And we can offer those resources and hopefully be a little bit more nimble and getting people test coverage in this environment.
So if I'm hearing you right, then, sorry, go ahead.
I think it might make sense to reach out to some of the individual CNCF projects that would benefit directly. I know, for example, Packet offers ARM, and offers cloud stuff to the projects individually as well, and some of them use them for their project-specific CI.
Yeah.
So finding, go ahead.
I've used Packet myself, and I've been pretty happy with it. I think one of the nice things about VMC specifically is that it is virtual. And I mean, if you haven't taken a look at it, just Google VMC, VMware VMC. And the reason I say it's on-prem in the cloud is because the ability to deploy and get things online and available to people is much faster than bare metal. For Packet, they'd have to set up some type of environment themselves, and the actual environment is there, and we can just offer APIs for them to script things. And hopefully we'll also be able to provide pre-made packages where, we talked about the difficulty or the complexity working with things like Tide and Prow. We want to be able to eventually say, hey, if you need to test this, just maybe use something similar to Tide's labels, and that get something up and running in our environment, because our environment will be persistent. So, for Packet, I'm not disparaging Packet at all. I think it's a wonderful, company and what they offer. But each individual user would have to maintain that persistent service that would manage those tests, or take part in the test infra project. In this case, that persistent environment is already set up, and you really just have to worry about the tests themselves.
So I think one of the questions that we were trying to answer is, even before, is anyone interested in joining the working group, is the working group the right place to have some of these discussions? Like, do we see an intersection with other SIGs? And if so, like, which ones should we be interacting with? Is that right, Fabio?
Well, I guess the other thing that would happen if we made it a working group is the talks would drop out of this meeting, which could be a good or bad thing.
I'm going to let Fabio answer, but I did have something to say with respect to SIG test.
I mean, my point here is that I think this is something that is not just in the scope of SIG VMware. I mean, SIG VMware can definitely sponsor this as the platform we're talking about is vSphere, right? Which is VMware's. But here, my point is there's a lot of SIGs that can benefit from this, and there's is something that could help make sure that Kubernetes works on, I would say, the most popular on-prem infrastructure, I guess, which is I'm sure many customers are using and many users are using to run Kubernetes. So I think it's like more of a service to the larger Kubernetes community, which is the basis for my proposal for creating the working group.
So is everybody in agreement that this should be a working group? This is one that the SIG should sponsor?
I mean, does it make sense to bring up this topic in SIG testing first, or no?
I guess I'm not in agreement, but I'm not in disagreement. I'm still undecided.
I certainly see the value of having a separate work group or engage other other communities, other groups. I kind of in the same boat with Steve. So I'm not sure, but I think it's wonderful.
What do you guys think that we should be? Next step, should we be talking to SIG testing, or should we just create a proposal and include them on kind of creating that proposal?
Well, are we ready to engage in a broader sense yet, or would we like to maybe call it a shakedown cruise of only applying the automated testing to the cloud provider, and then after we get a little more experience, open it to the broader community? Or do you want to take community participation from the beginning?
Yeah.
I think that's really the issue here.
Steve, the way Steve put it just now, I think I agree with him, and I think Clint, you and I discussed it last week in the same respect. Maybe even a two-part approach where we involve people who are from this SIG who are interested in getting something like Steve just described up and running. And then once we have something and have a little bit of better understanding of what it looks like for us, then to involve others. Because as Steve just put it, we need this for some of VMware's projects. I don't want to delay that solution by virtue of everybody else being involved from the very beginning necessarily. Then again, I don't want to make them feel excluded. So I'm going to defer to people like Fabio who have experience with this and maybe others, because I'm not sure what the correct course of action is. I just don't want to offend them by not inviting them early, but I also just don't want to have it die on the vine in committee.
I think we should probably be, so I guess that we agree that this might be a good idea, right? So it's something that is worth at least understanding if it's actually a viable thing to do. So I think writing down some sort of proposal or charter for the group, and then maybe float that with the SIG testing leads, or maybe even putting that on the SIG testing agenda, and or even discussing that on a Slack channel. I think it's fine. I mean,
in fact, at the last storage SIG face-to-face meeting, there were a few people, Brad in particular from Red Hat, who are very much interested in utilizing the vSphere infrastructure for doing testing that was beyond just using the vSphere storage plugin.
Hey,
so
Steve,
there are people interested, and it isn't just the testing sake.
Steve, we're definitely aware of Brad, and we've had some communications. We just, since he wasn't able to make the call, we didn't want to bring him up. But yeah, would be very interested in his support and whatnot. But yeah, for me, it boils down to, we're going to be doing something like this regardless for our own needs. So, Clint, I mean, if we're going to be doing this regardless, is it going to be a problem if we end up doing something that, maybe others don't like to get tests for us, and then we edit it late and we revise that later? Could there be parallel efforts? Again, I'm just worried that it will slow down our own testing. But if we do it on our own, does that upset people?
Well, it's not like this is being done in the dark, right? It's just, because we can't be doing that. Yeah. But we can continue to do it under the auspices of VMware SIG, maybe for a few more weeks until we're ready for broader publication. That's just something.
I agree with Steve there.
Okay, sounds like a plan. So we'll table that for now, and we'll schedule for further discussion in the next meeting or the one after.
I don't have the meeting notes up. Can someone just take a note of what our action is there? What the decision is?
Can you put that down, Steve? I think you were.
Yeah, I'll get to it.
Okay. Okay. I think we're reached a conclusion with that, at least for now. So I'll just go over to the next item on the agenda, which is the demo. And today we have SAP presenting their tool named Gardener. So we have Vasu and Prashant.
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Let
Let me relinquish the screen, and so you can take it.
Okay.
All right, it should be good to go.
So first of all, thanks to Michael Gasch for making the connection, right? And I don't want to repeat the same stuff what we did in the Kubernetes community meetup. It's recorded anyway, but just the gist of it. So in essence, what we did in Project Gardener is a multi-cluster creation and operational tool which allows us to create clusters over all the hypercloud providers and even on-prem, right? And what we essentially did, I don't think I need to explain self-hosting and all that to you, but we did apply a special pattern, and I think it makes sense to go over the broad scopes of that, right? So essentially, we have a central garden cluster, we called it, a Kubernetes cluster, in which we install our central Gardener component as an extension API server, right? So there's an extension API server and a nice dashboard, a UI for that, and obviously a controller manager and all that logistics around the extension API server. And if we want to create a Kubernetes cluster on a target infrastructure, what we do need is essentially a target infrastructure, and in this case, let's say this is a VMware vSphere environment on premise. Then what we would like to see is another Kubernetes cluster, highly available on-prem, being established by the customer himself or by a partner or whatever tooling it is. We can also help with that. We have some scripting tools. There's also some other stuff we're working on, which can get this going. But then when we create the cluster or the individual cluster to work on itself, what we do is we create a namespace, use namespace isolation, and we create a control plane in that namespace. So that's, you can think of it as like a control plane as a service, if you'd like, right? So the usual API, the control plane components, API server, and so on. We add a little bit of monitoring and logging logic next to it, individual per cluster control plane, so to speak. And then what we do is we run a terraforming job to prepare the network. On AWS, for example, this means the VPC is created, the security groups, and so on. But that's basically it. And then we essentially start a component called the machine controller, which makes the VMs become a primary citizen of Kubernetes itself, right? And we have, and that's where Prashant is going to detail of how that is implemented. I'm just going to go over the broad architecture, and then the rest of it is essentially, you know, all about that. What we're also interested in is, there's a project, I reached out to Fabio before that, around the virtual kubelet. We at the moment, we probably need the VMs because we have workload on top, which save data on the local storage, and there's data locality stuff. But we're really interested in whether we could carry this over and make our machine controller also onboard the integration to VIC, or yeah, I think it's called at least the container as a service method, which the infrastructure itself derives. So let's come to the machine controller itself, this controller which makes VMs or machines primary citizens. So from logic, essentially, we combine two principles, essentially, like getting pieces of infrastructure, like as an example, the storage provisioner with the storage classes, and the pod deployment itself, where a replica set gives us essentially the possibility of doing rolling updates. And we combine that, last not least, into a component we called the machine controller. Now you have the possibility to say, I want to have a machine deployment of 5 or 6 VMs. It has specific machine classes at hand for various different infrastructures. And now we get a machine, and then we can correlate that to a node. And that's basically, from a high-level architecture perspective, what we're doing here. And since this is all a Kubernetes citizen, this gives us essentially the possibility to abstract infrastructure completely away. That means we have I'd say a cluster bus. Of course, it's not correct to name it cluster bus, but we get metrics, we get where we have the machine deployments plugged in. So essentially, the autoscaler component can make decisions, and if it needs to, say, for example, decides that there's a need for another machine of type with GPUs, it just needs to change the YAML file or the resource object, and there we go. And the same is done with the upgrader, right? So if you want to upgrade the whole situation, you can go in, change the reference in the machine class from operating system version 1.0 to operating system 2.0, and the machine deployment controller goes around and starts rolling updates of these things. So we all have this in production. In a matter of time, I didn't want to go and show it to you live because there's a VPN problem at home. So this is how this really looks like in production for us, right? So we have this UI also in the open source, where we have multiple clusters on various infrastructures, and for the DevOps teams, you can see, they can immediately see if there's a problem on one of the clusters, on different hypercloud providers. We also get a health check if everything is okay. And what we also can do is we can connect problems to an issue system. In this case, we have connected it with our GitHub issue system, so we can talk to our users and have a journal of what went wrong. And essentially, this is why we're here. We are using it daily on these 4 infrastructures, right? The big cloud providers and OpenStack, which we use internally. And our Chinese colleagues have integrated the Alibaba, Aliyun stuff, which we don't run centrally, but essentially that's in. But VMware, we don't have a notion, we don't have the expertise, like Stephen Wong, you just mentioned earlier, that you're working on a best practice document. We don't have this detailed expertise. And that's kind of what our ask is, to extend this in the open source so that we can actually also integrate VMware, because we have a lot of customers and so on who would like to replicate this thing in their own environment and run it as well. And essentially here, just another screenshot of how you can choose your infrastructure in a small wizard. Yeah, and the autoscaler here is integrated in that. And last not least, because we also have the updating mechanism integrated, we can automatically do operating system updates and even patch the minor versions fully automatically, right? So that's it from my side. I'd like to hand off to Prashant. If there are any questions on this level, please go ahead.
Right? Yeah, I do have a question here. What is the compatibility story regarding you're talking to GC and different cloud providers and different versions potentially?
Can you repeat the question? It's the compatibility, you mean?
Right. Since the gardener is talking to different providers, potentially they're having different Kubernetes version or API version. And so are you compatible to make sure compatible to any of them? Or
I think the if I may repeat the question, it's about compatibility, because so first of all, if it's about the seed cluster, it can be an older cluster. We don't need version compatibility with respect to the seed. At least as long as we're able to inject and talk to the API server, we can actually run a newer or older Kubernetes version in a completely orthogonal version of Kubernetes in the seed. So, and that's what we actually do. So our seed cluster, I'm not so sure, is probably still version 1.9 something, but we are hosting a control plane with version 1.10. It's completely orthogonal. Was that your question?
Thanks.
Okay, I've got a question on what the scope of this is. If you look at what's taken on by KubeADM, it kind of skips issues like ingress, network routing, and does Gartner take on those, or does it at this point declare them out of scope? Because those kinds of things are very variable between one cloud provider and another too. So I'm just wondering,
Yes.
if Gartner was to target the vSphere platform, what would be your vision of how you would address network ingress and routing?
Yes, it's a very good question. So we have various different scenarios here. So there's one scenario in our on-premise environment where we have an F5 router, where we can connect the overlay network directly using BGP, right? In this case, we're using Calico, and F5 does ingress level 4 and level 7 for us, right? And so indeed, there are various nuances of changes. We're trying to be as homogeneous as possible on every cloud provider, right? But when we have a VMware environment and we wouldn't be able to use Calico, or we would be able to use another overlay network, we would obviously make those configuration changes possible, right? We have a so-called cloud provider cloud config YAML file where you are able to describe how the cluster is then set up in the VMware environment. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I guess it does. It sounds like, it just strikes me that in a vSphere environment, there might be people who have an F5 in place, but given that it's on-prem, you could find a bunch of other permutations too. I mean, if you're in a cloud like Amazon Cloud, there's only one way to go with your ingress. There's only one option to go with your network routing. But when you change to on-prem, there's a lot of them. So
of course,
that might be a potential consideration here. I'm just wondering.
And the whole project is open source. So we indeed, if we get permutations of these kinds, and there's also the notion of, at the moment we are developing a lot of these things in tree, and we're making the same experience. We want to take this out of tree, and then that gives another set of options, obviously, to handle these permutations.
Vasu?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Michael. Just maybe to add some color to this, because we went through this when we had like earlier discussions on this, and Steve is making a good point. So what we actually were thinking is, in order to reduce the complexity and increase the standardization of the on-premises Gartner deployment stack, that, for example, deployments like VMware Cloud Foundation or VMware Validated Designs, which are all around the software-defined data center, where you have, for example, NSXT and vSAN, etc. Those components already in there that give you the kind of the standardization and kind of private cloud experience that you also have in the public cloud with standardized APIs, and also from a networking and storage perspective. Because I think the only way to succeed in there is, like Steve already said, reduce the complexity and the moving parts and components that are involved there. And I think we need to think about that maybe from a VVD or VCF perspective.
Thank you. That's a good statement. We want to integrate into the stack as high as possible, as standardized as possible. And if you have programs like these in place, then that's exactly what we would then say, hey, look, this is what we validated with. This is how you could get this on-prem. Exactly. Start from there. That's the easiest. If not, open up your IDE and start developing.
Exactly.
Vasu, in the interest of time, can we move forward with the demo?
Yes.
Going a little over.
Prashant, can you take over?
Yeah. Can you guys see my screen? right now?
We can.
Yeah.
Yep.
I just have a couple of slides just to show you how the machine controller works. So this is our declarative way to manage machines for a K8s cluster, as was already described. So how this would work is we have our regular kubectl, you have your API server, you have your etcd. What we have is we have something called as a machine class where you can fill in your spec, like what type of machine you're using, what's the disk image, what's the disk size, a lot more fields. I just shorten it down. And there's another interesting field for secret, which is nothing but a reference to a Kubernetes secret, which has your cloud provider keys or some init scripts, cloud init scripts that we have. Now, what we do is we deploy these into our cluster, this machine class and the secret, and let's call this as version 1 of it. And then what we create is called a machine deployment object. We refer it to this class, say class V1, and say we have 3 replicas of this particular machine deployment. Now what we have is component called the machine deployment controller. And what it does is it looks at this machine deployment with 3 replicas and creates a machine set with 3 replicas. These analogies are taken right from the Kubernetes deployment replica set and pods, right? And so then the machine set controller in turn looks at the machine set and creates 3 machine objects. And now all these are CRDs, the ones marked in yellow, right? And then we have this machine controller, which would look at the machine objects and it would talk to the cloud provider API, depending on what cloud provider you're using, and create these 3 VMs. Right now, we have these support for these providers. And we have then these machines then register back to the kube controller manager. And it creates these node objects, right? And these node objects are the Kubernetes node objects, which report their health status back to the machines. This is how we monitor the health of a machine and replace it when something goes unhealthy or something like that. All these controllers together form this machine controller manager that I'm talking about. And this is our implementation. And quickly, let me go through how autoscaling also works. So say, for example, you have a three node cluster and all your nodes are full. And the pod comes in and it goes to this unschedulable state. Now we have the community-driven autoscaler project, right? But it acts on cloud provider specific autoscaling groups. So what we have done is we have modified the cluster autoscaler and made it understand our machine deployment spec. So now the cluster autoscaler can see the unschedulable pod and it can directly talk to the machine deployment and increase the number of replicas. And then the machine controller manager would create a new machine, the flow goes on, there's a new node, and then your pod gets scheduled and it comes on this new node. This is how our autoscaling works. And if I'm hurrying or if you want me to go slow, let me know, right? And yeah, these are some how you would add support for a new provider. So right now, like I mentioned already, we have support for AWS, Azure, GCP, and OpenStack. And Alibaba is in PR. We are just reviewing it. And then the current state is that to implement a new cloud provider, all you would do is you would need to implement these 3 methods, which are the create, get, and delete VMs method. It's well documented and you can find it here. I've shared the link. And what we have in pipeline is we have this support for out-of-tree drivers. Although this is pretty easy right now to integrate the code, but you'll have to create a PR on our repo. Like Vasu mentioned, that we have this support for out-of-tree providers. There's a work in progress, there's a PR pending. And once this is in place, you can basically have your driver code in your own repo, and we will manage the MCM code in something along those lines.
Is there any chance you could put a link to this deck in the chat or the meeting notes? So
yeah,
I wanted to follow that link for adding a new cloud provider. And
yeah, sure.
I'm just wondering, I read the blog article that talked about it using Terraform. Is that an assumption that's built in, or could you add a cloud provider without utilizing Terraform?
So what we do right now is we use the SDKs provided by each cloud provider to interact with them. So this helps us with upgradation and much easier management of VMs. When we stick to Terraform,
Prashant, I think Stephen is asking about the terraforming job before. So we're not using Terraform to create VMs. It's only to prepare the network area in which the VMs need to be materialized. right? So, and there we're using Terraform at the moment because there's a broad scope of provider APIs which are supported.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Just let me quickly show you how it would look. Just 2 minutes more. I would just show you how easy it would be to just implement something if you wanted to support vSphere. This is the driver for AWS. So you would have something similar. You'll need to define this create method, which just talks to the cloud provider, creates a VM. And then you would have a delete method, which actually deletes the VM. And then we have this get existing is nothing for now, but the main is the get VMs method, which lists actually the VMs. And to show you just quickly how easy it would look like, I have the AWS console right now. Let me just refresh this page. I'm going to try creating this test machines. Right now, none of the machines are in a running state. What I would do is I have a cluster running with machine controller running. I'm just taking in the logs of the machine controller manager. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a watch over this test machine that I'm going to try to create. And here what I have is ignore the warnings. It's due to some latency. So here I have a machine class that I've already deployed in the cluster. Let me just show you how a machine class would look like. Yes. Okay. So so here the machine class, you have a namespace in which it's deployed. That's where your machine controller would be watching over. And then you have the spec where you, in this case, provide the AMI because it's a AWS machine class, the block device, the size, the IAM roles, machine type, network interfaces, regions. This is the secret ref I was talking to you about. And now I'll quickly show you how a machine YAML spec would look like. This is all you would do in a machine spec. So you'd give it a name, you'd give it a namespace, you would say class, and you would point it to the class that just showed you earlier. So what I would do is I just do a kubectl apply machine.yaml, similar to how you would do with the pod. Yeah. As soon as you create this machine object, the controller has picked it up. You see here, it's created, and you see on the right, the watch that I had, it actually picked up this object, did some processing on it, gave it a provider ID. Now, if you go back to the console and refresh this, you see a test machine running. So it's as simple as that, and it takes about 2 minutes to join the cluster. If you do a get nodes, maybe after 2 minutes. In the interest of time, I'm skipping on that. Similar to how we did a machine, you could do a machine set and a machine deployment. It would eventually create these machine objects and work how I showed you in the picture. Does that look good? Does anyone have any questions?
I do have a question. It's not necessarily related to the to the provider, but it's more like I see this as like a large effort from you guys. There's a lot of code. There's a lot of stuff here. Have you thought about maybe putting that putting Gartner under the CNCF, or like trying to propose that as a project, CNCF project?
Yes, indeed, we're thinking about that, but there's a little bit of a barrier. So first of all, the easiest now we got that, a little bit of GitHub stars, but then we need to showcase that it's not only SAP using it, but there is also some other adopters who are taking it, and we have to show that people are actually contributing to it, and so on, right? And then the idea is indeed that we would take the sandboxing or the incubation path, and this is exactly where we want to go with this.
Yeah, that's great.
Quick question. Is this based on the cluster API?
We are actually in discussion with the cluster SIG Lifecycle Cluster API working group, and currently, I think on the highest level, you could say the cluster API working group is using kubeadm, and so therefore they also are tackling the bootstrapping problem, right? And in the recent discussions, I would say we would like to take the bootstrapping question out of the game at this point. So if we also have a cluster specification, and those are all key value attributes, I guess we will quickly also change the naming to match the ones which we agree upon. And if there'll be a version 1.0, we'll also support it, albeit because we in the beginning say there's an initial setup necessary, we are not tackling the master node setup, right? So that part is kind of out, right? And if we agree on that, then we'll be also conformant. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. My question was like your machine controller and all that stuff. Is it like compatible, or is it the same that is actually used in the cluster API implementations, or is it a completely different thing?
No, there are actually 3 or 4 different implementations which are available, or which I know of, right? Ours is one proposal, and once we kind of agree on the spec, right? It doesn't actually matter which implementation you take, right? The only thing which I can say is ours is the machine controller is also in the open source, completely in the open source.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Yeah, and last but not least, one of the asks. Look, we don't have a VMware environment at our disposal. We don't have VMware expertise in our small open source team. And that's essentially the asks to, which I was talking also to Michael. Is there anyone in the VMware SIG which could help us to implement the VMware provider for us? And on the second, we'd be very interested to get access to the testing infrastructure so that we can integrate once we have something working, and do a continuous build and test this all the time, because it's really problematic to always carry along dead code with you, right?
Yeah, I think for the testing infrastructure, I think as you've seen on the call, we're very early on that. But if you follow the next meeting, we're definitely working on providing some sort of vSphere environment for Kubernetes related project to test on. So that's definitely a possibility in the future. Mm-hmm. For supporting the work to build a machine driver for vSphere, I guess that depends on the amount of effort. I know, well, for a fact, we have a Go library for the vSphere API, so Go vMommy, which would definitely help in this case. So it will just be a matter of creating the glue between your interface and the Go vMommy API. If there's anyone that is willing to step up, we'll definitely have this is definitely the best venue to get support for the project. So I guess that we'll definitely reach out to the people also in the channel that may be not attending, and also this meeting is recorded and published on YouTube, so people that might end up seeing this after the fact might want to reach out. So SIG VMware on Kubernetes Slack. Please, if you want to contribute and watching this video, reach out to Vasu or Prashant or to the channel, and we can make the right connection.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for the demo. That was very well done. Good project as well. We're about 4 minutes from the top of the hour. Let's see if we can get to the discussion really quick. We do have just one thing today. So hopefully it's going to be quick. So Michael is asking, question from customer, when to expect token base off for the vSphere cloud provider.
Yeah, that's solved. Doug left a comment in the agenda doc, so it's in 1.11. Thank you. That was a quick one.
Great. That's if it's solved and it's quick, it's always great, right? Okay. Cool. So we don't have anything left on the agenda, and we're 3 minutes behind. So I guess that we can I can give that back to you guys and see everybody in 2 weeks for the next SIG VMware meeting. And if you guys have any questions, reach out to the Kubernetes Slack channel SIG VMware. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks.